Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. We have a really fascinating deep dive plan today. And it all started with one of you sending us this ebook,
It did. It did.
The Power of Concentration by Theron Q. Dumont.
That's right.
This one goes back to 1998, so quite a while ago. But I think as we go through it, we're going to find there's a lot of timeless wisdom in here.
I think you're absolutely right.
It's all about helping individuals unlock greater success and self-mastery. And it all comes down to focusing our minds.
Right.
So we're going to be exploring Dumont's work, extracting the most valuable insights, and hopefully you guys will walk away from this with some really practical advice and principles
I hope so too.
that you can use to navigate your own goals and challenges.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things that's interesting about concentration is, we think about it in terms of work,
Yeah.
but it really does touch every area of life,
Yeah.
from your personal relationships to your health.
Absolutely. I think the ability to concentrate is fundamental. As I was reading through this book again, what I found was it's kind of an overlooked skill,
Oh, it is, yeah.
We kind of take it for granted that we know how to concentrate, but there's actually a lot more to it.
There is. And there are things that get in the way of it,
Yes.
like our modern lifestyle.
Precisely.
So Dumont, right off the bat, establishes like a core premise, I guess we could say,
Yes.
that concentration really is kind of the bedrock of achieving anything.
I agree. It's the bedrock. He really lays it out there. If you want to be successful in anything, you have to be able to concentrate.
Right.
And what I think he means by that is not just thinking about something, but directing all of your mental energy towards the thing that you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
I think it's so easy for us to, kind of dabble in a lot of different things, and to kind of spread ourselves thin. But he's really advocating for this idea of focusing all of your energy on a single point. I think that's really powerful.
It is, and it's very counter to how we're, taught to live these days.
Right.
You've got to multitask. You've got to be doing all these things at once.
Yeah, we're constantly bombarded with information and stimulation.
Sure.
And it really does make it difficult to kind of get into that state of deep focus.
It does. Okay, so let's dig into some of the specifics here. Dumont talks about this idea of our two natures.
Yes.
One side that's striving for growth,
Right.
and then another that's sort of holding us back.
Yes.
So how does concentration play into, like, this internal dynamic, I guess you could say?
He's really saying, that the side of our nature that we focus on is the one that gets stronger. So if we're constantly focusing on, our fears or our doubts or our limitations, that's the side that's going to gain momentum.
Right.
But if we can shift our focus to the side of our nature that wants to grow and expand and achieve things, then that's the side that's going to get stronger. So concentration is really the fuel that we're giving to, our potential.
Okay.
And he even talks about this idea that through concentrated effort, we can overcome what might seem like really, really challenging, like insurmountable obstacles.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about being, like, born with a certain talent or a certain IQ or, those types of things.
Exactly. I think what he's saying is that even if you have the same level of natural ability as someone else,
Okay.
the person who can concentrate better, the person who can really harness their mental energy is going to have a huge advantage.
Right.
And so it's really about training that faculty of the mind.
Okay. And, that leads us really nicely into this next point, which is concentration as self-mastery and control.
Mhm.
And it sounds like it goes beyond just, being able to sit down and focus on a task.
It does. It does. It really gets into this idea of, concentration equals strength of mind. The ability to concentrate is really the ability to control yourself, to control your thoughts, to control your desires, to control your plans.
Right.
And he makes this point, too, that a person who doesn't have that ability to concentrate can be easily swayed by others.
Right.
So it's very much about being able to kind of to steer your own course.
Right.
And not be kind of, blown about by every wind that comes along.
Right.
And he even suggests that this can lead to the power to influence others.
Which is an interesting connection.
It is. It is.
Why do you think he connects those two?
Well, I think there's this idea that when we're really concentrated, when our mind is really focused, there's a certain energy that we project.
Okay.
And it's an energy that can be, persuasive, it can be inspiring, it can be influential.
Right.
And I think he also makes this point that concentration helps to align our will and our intellect. So it's not just about having a strong will or having a sharp intellect.
Right.
It's about, bringing those two things together so that they're working in harmony.
Right.
And I think that's where the real power comes from.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that get in the way of good concentration, some of the causes.
Oh, yeah.
What did Dumont identify as being like some of the biggest roadblocks?
Well, he talks about a few different things.
Okay.
And, some of this is a little bit dated.
Okay.
But I think the principles still apply.
Okay.
He talks about something called a deficiency of the motor centers.
Okay.
And I think what he's referring to there is, like, people who have a hard time sitting still.
Okay.
People who are, kind of fidgety, people who have, like, a lot of, restless energy.
Right.
And he says that can really interfere with our ability to concentrate. He also talks about, just an impulsive and emotional mind, people who are easily distracted, people who are easily, kind of swept away by their emotions.
Right.
And then he also talks about an untrained mind.
Okay.
Which I think is probably the most common.
Okay.
It's just a mind that hasn't been, disciplined and trained to focus.
Okay. So when he says untrained mind, is he talking about like, someone who is just never, tried to sit down and read a book cover to cover, never tried to, sit still and meditate or something like that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think it's just a mind that hasn't learned how to control its own thoughts.
Okay.
And he's very clear that this is something that can be learned.
Okay.
It's not something that you're, born with or without. It's something that you can develop through practice.
Okay.
And he's really optimistic about, our ability to improve our concentration. But he also talks about some things that can make it really difficult to concentrate.
Right.
Like negative states of mind.
Okay.
So, if you're really angry or if you're really anxious or if you're really depressed, it's going to be really hard to concentrate.
Right.
And he even says that, that these negative states of mind can actually be harmful to the brain.
Okay.
So it's really important to manage our emotions.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point because, I think sometimes we feel like, oh, I'm really concentrating on this problem.
Right.
Like I can't stop thinking about it. It's like keeping me up at night. I'm so worried about it.
Right.
But that's not really what he's talking about.
No, that's not true concentration.
Okay.
That's worry. That's anxiety. That's rumination.
Right.
True concentration is a much more positive state of mind.
Okay.
It's a much more powerful state of mind.
So it's not just like, the intensity of the thought, but the quality of the thought, I guess you could say.
I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah. And I think he also makes this point that true concentration requires strength of mind.
Okay.
And strength of will.
Okay.
It's not something that just happens passively.
Right.
It's something that you have to exert yourself.
Right.
You have to put in the effort.
Okay, so we understand the why.
Yes.
We understand some of the roadblocks.
Right.
Let's talk about how. What are some specific techniques Dumont recommends for building our concentration skills?
Well, I think one of the most important things he talks about is self-observation.
Okay.
Really paying attention to our own thoughts and feelings and learning how to regulate them.
Okay.
Because if we're not aware of what's going on in our own minds,
right,
we're not going to be able to control it.
Okay.
He also talks about this idea of what he calls focalizing the mind, which is really just, picking something and focusing your attention on it and holding it there until you've really, thought it through.
Okay.
And he says that this is something that, takes practice.
Okay.
But it's something that gets easier the more you do it.
Okay. He also gets into some physical things, which I think are really interesting.
Yeah.
Like we usually think about concentration as being like a purely mental thing, but he gets into things like, controlling our movements, our physical movements.
Absolutely. He says that our bodies and our minds are really interconnected.
Okay.
And that if we can, calm our bodies down, if we can still our bodies, that it's going to make it easier to calm our minds down and to still our minds.
Right.
And so he talks about, simple things like controlling our eye movements, not letting our eyes kind of dart around all the time.
Right.
Controlling our, our fingers, our hands, not fidgeting. And he says that, these little things can actually make a big difference.
Okay.
Because they're using up energy.
Right.
Our nervous energy is being dissipated through these little movements.
Okay.
And that leaves us with less energy to focus our minds.
And the analogy he uses is the steam engine.
Yes.
which is really vivid. If you've got all these valves open and the steam's escaping, there's no power to drive the engine.
Right.
So it's about, closing off those valves.
Yes.
So we can build up the steam and have the power to concentrate.
Exactly. I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay, so there's this connection then between, like, a steady body and a steady mind.
Yes, absolutely. And he talks about how you can steady your nerves and your muscles through exercises.
Okay.
And I think this is something that a lot of people find, really beneficial today.
Okay.
Whether it's yoga or Tai Chi or even just, going for a walk in nature. There's something about, moving our bodies in a mindful way that can really help to steady our minds.
Okay, and what about breathing? He talks about breathing.
He does. He talks about the importance of controlled breathing.
Okay.
So, slow, deep breaths.
Okay.
He emphasizes, prolonged exhalations.
Okay.
He says that helps to calm the mind and the body.
Okay.
And to make them, more fit for concentration.
So even if we're not necessarily doing yoga or Tai Chi, just that act of taking some slow, deep breaths can be really beneficial.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the simplest and most effective things that we can do.
Okay.
When we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed or distracted, just to take a few deep breaths.
Right.
And it can really help to kind of reset our nervous system.
So it's almost like a little mini meditation.
Exactly.
Okay. And he even talks about these really, almost like mundane exercises, right? Like controlling your ear movements, your finger movements, your eye movements.
Yeah. And I think this might seem a little odd to us, but, he was writing this book over 100 years ago.
Okay.
And I think, at that time there was a lot more emphasis on kind of physical discipline as a way to train the mind.
Yeah.
And so he's really suggesting that by, gaining control over these small muscles, these small movements, that we can actually gain better control over our minds.
So even these little things, like you said, that might seem kind of, mundane, can actually have an impact on our mental state.
Exactly. I think it's all about, building that discipline, building that ability to control ourselves.
Okay.
And he talks about static exercises, things like just holding a position, or focusing on a single point for an extended period of time.
Right.
He says that those are really effective for holding our faculties at work, for really gaining control over our minds.
So it's that kind of mind-body connection again.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. What about decision-making? He talks about that, right?
He does.
Like the speed at which we make decisions.
Yes. He advises practicing making quicker decisions, in small, daily affairs.
Okay.
Because he says that builds up the ability to make larger decisions.
Okay.
And, I think there's something to that.
Yeah.
If we're constantly second-guessing ourselves, if we're constantly, procrastinating, it's going to be really hard to make those big decisions when they come along.
Right.
But if we're used to making decisions quickly and efficiently, then it's going to be much easier.
So it's like building up that mental muscle of decisiveness.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he also talks about acting on our resolutions.
He does. He says it's important to act promptly on our resolutions.
Okay.
Not to put things off, because every time we act on a resolution, it strengthens our will.
Okay.
And it makes it easier to act on the next resolution.
Okay.
And so he's really talking about, ingraining habits.
Right.
Good habits.
Okay. And this is interesting, this idea of the gratuitous exercise for the will.
Right.
What does that mean?
So this is basically the idea that we should be doing things that are difficult.
Okay.
Just for the sake of doing them.
Okay.
Not because they're, enjoyable, not because they're easy, not because they're, going to lead to some immediate reward.
Okay.
But just because it's good for our will.
Okay.
So he gives the example of, taking a cold shower.
Okay.
Or going for a run when you really don't feel like it.
Okay.
Or doing some other kind of, challenging task that you don't necessarily want to do.
Right.
But he says that by doing these things, we're strengthening our will.
Right.
And we're making it easier to do the things that we do want to do.
Okay.
When we have to do them.
So it's kind of like an insurance policy.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, if you go to the gym and you lift weights.
Okay.
You're not doing it because you want to, be able to lift that weight in that moment.
Right.
You're doing it because you want to be strong.
Right.
You want to be able to lift heavy things in the future.
Right.
And so this gratuitous exercise for the will, it's the same idea.
Okay.
It's about, building up our mental strength so that we can, use it when we need it.
Okay. Let's talk about achieving our desires.
Okay.
And success in the business world.
Okay.
What does Dumont say about that in relation to concentration?
So this is where he introduces this principle of mental attraction.
Okay.
And it's this idea that what we focus on is what we attract into our lives.
Okay.
So if we're constantly focusing on negative things, we're going to attract more negative things.
Right.
But if we can focus on positive things,
right,
on the things that we want to achieve,
right,
on our goals,
okay,
then we're going to attract more of those things.
Okay.
And he tells this really great story of a bank messenger who, just through sheer force of will and concentration, rose to become the president of the bank.
Okay.
And he talks about how, this man was just so focused on his work, on his goals, on his desire to succeed, that he was able to achieve things that, other people thought were impossible. Okay,
so our thoughts really do shape our reality then, according to Dumont.
That's exactly what he's saying, yeah. That our thoughts are not just, these kind of ephemeral things that float around in our heads.
Right.
They actually have power.
Okay.
They have the power to shape our experiences.
Right.
They have the power to create our reality.
Okay. And he even talks about how, the way we think and the things we think about, show up on our faces. Literally.
He does, yeah. He uses this kind of this analogy of how, if you were to look at someone's face, you could tell a lot about their life.
Okay.
You could tell, if they've been happy or sad.
Okay.
You could tell if they've been worried or stressed. Yeah. You could tell if they've, lived a life of kind of, indulgence or a life of discipline.
Right.
And he's saying that our thoughts, they leave their mark on us.
Yeah.
They leave their mark on our faces.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I think that's interesting too, because it kind of gets to this idea that we are what we think.
Right.
And I think, in a way that's true.
I think it's very true. Yeah.
If we're constantly thinking negative thoughts,
right,
we're going to have a negative outlook on life.
Right.
And that's going to show up in our demeanor, in our expressions.
Absolutely.
But if we can train ourselves to think more positively, to think more constructively,
yes,
then that's going to show up too.
It is. And he also talks about how, this concentrated thought can inspire confidence in others.
Okay.
So if you're around someone who's really focused, who's really determined, who's really, kind of got their act together, it can be really inspiring. It can make you feel more confident. It can make you feel like, you can achieve anything.
Okay.
And he also talks about how this concentrated thought can attract good things into our lives, without even having to really try that hard.
Okay.
It's just a matter of kind of setting our minds on what we want.
Right.
And then, kind of letting the universe take care of the rest.
Okay. What does he say about this idea of we're all kind of mentally connected? Is there something to that?
He does talk about this idea that, humanity is linked together through thought.
Okay.
And that there's this power in cooperative thought.
Okay.
And that we can actually help each other achieve our goals by thinking about them together.
Okay.
And he uses this term, sowing the thought seeds of success.
Okay.
Which I think is a really beautiful way to put it.
Okay.
It's like if we can plant these seeds of success in our minds,
right,
and then, kind of water them with our attention, with our focus, with our energy,
right,
that they will grow.
Okay. He also talks about something called the concentrated mental demand, right?
Yes.
What is that?
So this is basically if you really, really want something.
Okay.
And you focus all of your mental energy on it.
Okay.
And you don't let anything distract you. You can actually make it happen. It's almost like you're putting in an order to the universe.
Right.
And the universe has to deliver.
Okay. So, there's the attraction part, but he's also saying that concentration helps us develop mental poise.
It does, yeah.
So being able to kind of roll with the punches, being able to stay calm under pressure.
Exactly. And he says that this mental poise helps us to control our emotions and to influence others.
Right.
And he's he's really, he's really big on this idea of controlling our emotions.
Right.
Because he says that our emotions can really get in the way of our success.
Right.
If we're constantly letting our emotions, kind of run wild, it's going to be really hard to achieve anything.
Right.
But if we can learn to control our emotions, then we're in the driver's seat. We're in control of our lives.
And he makes an interesting distinction though too, right? Like he's not saying, suppress your emotions, don't feel them.
No, not at all.
It's more about like managing them.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about being aware of them.
Okay.
It's about understanding them.
Okay.
But it's not about, letting them control us.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he's clear that dwelling on worry is not the same as concentration.
Right. And he says that this kind of involuntary concentration on worries can actually be dangerous.
Okay.
It can lead to all sorts of problems. Yeah. It can lead to, anxiety. It can lead to insomnia.
Right.
It can lead to, physical health problems.
Right.
So it's really important to be able to distinguish between, true concentration and this kind of, obsessive worry.
Right. Okay. And then he gets into this idea that successful lives are concentrated lives.
Yes.
And the flip side of that is lack of concentration leads to being cared for by charity.
Right.
That's a bold statement.
It is a bold statement.
What's he getting at there?
Well, I think he's saying that, if we're not able to focus our minds,
okay,
if we're not able to, to direct our energies,
right,
then we're gonna be at the mercy of others. We're not gonna be able to create our own lives.
Right.
We're not gonna be able to achieve our own goals.
Right.
We're gonna be, kind of dependent